up Gmail, like the whole Gmail. So you do the front end, you do the back end, you do all the interactions, you code them out, you present at the end of the semester, which was fine. Being a computer science program, you're expected to have hard projects. And being a computer science, being in the program, everybody started looking into certain kind of front-end technology or back-end technology, something really fancy that would make it very amazing from the technology side. But when I started looking into it, I started asking questions that if I'm supposed to redo the Gmail and Google does it much better, I might as well do some more work. So I started asking questions to all these people. What do you think could Gmail do better? Or I started asking questions about the usability. I had no idea what UX design was at that time. I was just trying to use my 2 cents. And at the end of the semester, I was able to finish off my project, but it was very different than the other people. Most people started talking about what kind of front-end technology they used, what kind of fancy back-end technology they used. But when I started my presentation, I spoke to like hundreds of people, asked them what went wrong, what would they like to see. And this way, after this course, I kind of fell in love with design. And I wasn't even aware that I was working on a certain kind of process, but it just came along. I was then given an opportunity to work as a web designer and a developer at my university itself, which was awesome. I'll tell you why it was awesome. They were looking for a candidate to design and develop. I was a grad student for computer science, and I had inclination for design. So that went well. Few months into my journey over there, I came to know about this marvelous facet of this UX design. I was fascinated by how technology and design can work together. So I started Googling, like as most people would do, curious about how to go about. So I started Googling, what is UX design? How do I become a UX designer? So the first answer came from that search was, you should have a portfolio to become a UX designer. I had no idea what that means. As a developer, I've never had any experience about creating a portfolio. So I was like, okay, fine. What do I do with a portfolio? So I Google searched and I was like, how do you create a portfolio? The basic answer that I got from most of the articles that I read online was, showcase your projects with your process. It's like, okay, your process, again, it's like, fine, there's something about this thing. So I started working on it. I figured it out. At the end of the day, I had a portfolio. I ended up having a job as a UX designer. I actually started as a backend developer. And then very quickly, I moved into UX design in the same company. And earlier this year, I started working with a design-oriented startup which develops enterprise software to backup data. It's into SaaS. And I lead the design team over there right now. So what I learned from all of these different experiences, and not even just at working at a company, but also while studying, while going through all these things, is if you want to be a good designer, you should have your own process. So there are some basic steps that are always involved, but you would have to actually have your process. And people can help you get to your process, but it is you who can identify it for yourself. So before I start, I just wanted to let you know that when you go out tonight from this talk, you will have 2 main tools in your design, in your kit, excuse me, that will enable you to be a better designer and help you create your process. So what is design process? Does anybody want to take a stab at it and say what a design process is or what just process is? Pretty simple, right? Steps, yes. That is absolutely right. It's steps. So most of us would have seen this picture while we are Googling. And this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. All of these. Okay, we all know that there's so many processes. Sorry. So we all know that there's so many processes, and the first question that comes to my mind or your mind when you look at this is, are these processes even right? Yes, of course. They are all right processes for the person who created them, for the person who has been designing. So, but does it fit you or me? Maybe, maybe not. Because they have been designed for a particular feature or a product or particular company. So they might not fit you. So in order for you to identify, let's talk about the series of actions or steps that that you pointed out here is, so the basic definition of design process is, it's a series of action taken in order to create a design for a given goal. So we can split this up into a couple of parts. That is, okay, it's definitely series of actions. We don't know what, but it is. To create a design, that's what we want to do, and given goal. So we work towards identifying that goal. So these steps are pretty important, and these are pretty basic steps. If we are aspiring to be a designer, or if we are in the industry for a while, we all know these are basic steps that we would want to look at, like research. We would go and start exploring things that we want to research on, and the problem statement that we are trying to solve. With help of all of those things, we would be able to define our problem statement. And based on that, we would start working on designing certain things, whether it could be wireframing or prototyping, high fidelity. It basically comes down to design. And then once that is done, we would like to validate our designs before we can actually send it out for development. So we would conduct user testing, or we would conduct certain kinds of testing, stakeholder testing. Once that is done, we might have to go back a step, redo our process, which is fine. So these are the basic steps. Once we have these basic steps, how do we put together in a way that makes sense? So how do we customize this design process? So mostly when we go out in the industry, you're asked to work on a feature. When you're asked to work on a feature, that means that you have to identify the steps in which you would like to get your designs done. It could be any way that you would want. Even your portfolio, if anybody of you here is working on your portfolio, you would have to do the same thing. You know the end goal, you want to create your portfolio, but how do you go about? What are the steps that will help you create your portfolio? So here, how many of you have seen this diagram before, or the chart before? Okay, amazing. Some of you have, some of you haven't. So this is called double diamond process. I like to call it as 4Ds. And it was designed or developed by British Design Council in 2005. So they were, I'm pretty sure, were super curious, like how I was, as in what's design and how people are going to do it. So they surveyed a lot of companies, and they came out with this double diamond process to see something that's common across all those interviews. So they realized that once a designer starts working on something, they quickly start diverging into discovering what was given to them. They start thinking about all these things, as in how they would go about. It could be a designer, it might not also be a designer, somebody involved in this process. Once this particular person, let's say designer here, would have a fair idea of all these wide spectrum of ideas, now they would have to come down to this one problem definition that they can solve for. Because as designers, you're always trained to solve for a problem. Are you trying to bring a solution to a given problem? So then that person or the designer would start converging down to define this particular definition or the problem definition so that they can work towards it. Now, once they have this problem definition that's like very narrow to the point, the designer here would start thinking about all possible ways in which they can solve. May it be whiteboarding or sketching or site maps, anything. It could be a lot of things that they start looking into. But then in order to deliver, there has to be very one pinpointed, let's say a prototype. Let's say a prototype or a link that has the prototype to development or for testing or for anything. There has to be this one point that they should give out. So then they start deciding on, okay, whether we want to go with a certain color or whether we want to go with a certain style or whatever. So they start converging towards one point. So basically the arrows show how the thought process goes. So this mostly works for the design, and if you are from a different team or if you are not a designer, this still might hold true, because you're always, as a human being, we are always solving for something. We're always trying to solve a problem. So just looking at the things that you can do in the first phase is there's a lot of research done. In the second one, you start creating these journey maps or personas, trying to come to this specific problem definition. Then once you have this specific problem definition, you start going crazy and start coming up with all these amazing ideas like whiteboarding or drawing or trying to figure out what goes inside your screen. And then once you have that, you start wireframing or prototyping to come to that one particular goal. Now, you might think this looks very, very flat. Like you do this step 1, step 2, step 3, and then it's done. But it doesn't work this way. It is not this simple, as in it's not very flat. You might have to go back a step. Let's say you didn't get good validation. You might have to go back a step. Now, how do you determine this? Let's walk through an example. I like to call it the road. So as you can see, there is a Golden Gate Bridge. So this is supposed to be San Francisco. And this is going to be our Los Angeles. So it's holidays. You decide to go from San Francisco, which is close by, to LA. So the first thing that you do is when you start planning, what do? You try to find out, you go to maps, you put in the source address, you put in the destination address, and then you immediately try to find the route. So first, you find the route. Awesome. Now, Google Maps is amazing. It will also tell you an alternate route. So it's like, okay, you have this route that probably would take about X amount of time, but the second route would take X plus Y amount of time, which might not be a lot. There might not be a lot of difference, and it could be. So now you have these two routes going to the same place. So the decision that you have to make here is which route to pick. So then kicks in all these criteria. Okay, food, gas. Would this route have enough food for me? Or would there be enough gas stations? What's the distance between these? Is this route going to be scenic, or is it going to be like super boring? And other criteria that you might have. So once we identify all these things, let's say our route A, that's our orange route, has a taco shop, one gas station, and an ice cream place. Our second route has a taco place, it's a scenic route, and a gas station. So as the person deciding, you would have to pick what you want. You would have to pick the ice cream or the scenic route, because now you could find, okay, you exactly have everything the same, and then obviously the distance is a factor, and then the other factors kick in. So now once you have these criterias, you know what you want. So while actually working towards designing your design process, these criterias or constraints will start popping up. And these will be the main reasons your design process will be the way it will be. So let's take a design scenario. I work for an enterprise company. Hypothetically, my company has me lead a project to design a dog adoption mobile app. They want to do something nice, they want to contribute, they want to give back to the society. They told me that you will have 2 other designers work with us. So it will be me plus 2 other people. And I just have 3 weeks. So I was like, okay, awesome. Now, having this, that's all the information I have. And I'll tell you, I love dogs. I love looking at dog pictures on Instagram, but I'm not a dog person. I don't have pets, but I'm not a dog person. So the new thing here for me is the mobile app. I work for an enterprise company. I have no idea how this mobile app would work or how to design a mobile app. I might know the basics, but I'm not a specialist in it. I don't even have the budget to hire a person who actually designs mobile apps. And the other bigger limitation is 3 weeks. I have to do this in 3 weeks. Number of designers, yeah, I think I have enough designers to work on the same thing. And research. There was no research given to me. There was no product manager or a person who has expertise in this field. Let's say one of the person in my team has a pet and the other person doesn't, and the third person is me, which is not really helpful. So we have to do a lot of research. Now, this, I would start with the template that I have about discover, define, develop, and deliver. So I might have to work it out with this particular template, because this is, let's say this is the template I have. So my pain point is the mobile app and the research. So I don't know. I don't have any research. So I might have to spend a lot of time doing research, but then I might have a little bit lesser time to come to a problem statement. And I might not spend a lot of time diverging to see my options, because I and my team would need a lot more time to converge on the app, because we don't have the expertise in designing a mobile app. So editing this diagram a little bit, my design process would look something like this. The reason being, I would need a lot more time to do the research. I can quickly come to the problem definition. I don't have a lot of time, as I mentioned, to go down and look for all these fancy visuals. So I would need a lot more time to actually design and go back and forth. So my process would kind of look like this. So let's do some activity. Find a neighbor or two, talk to them about your existing process. It doesn't have to be a work process. It could be something that you're using right now for a different team, or if you're doing some project with your at school, or you're trying to design your portfolio. What kind of process do you follow? What are those steps? And then try to apply this to the template, and then talk to your neighbor. You could probably get in, talk to the person on their left or right, or probably both, and hear your neighbor out as well. Let's spend like 5-ish minutes on this, and then we can continue. I'll leave this on here so that you can look at the template. How did it go? Yeah, it is. So how was it? Did you guys, yeah? Do you guys want to share some of your experiences or some interesting ideas that might have popped up during the conversation? Yes.
Sticky notes, right? So you just gather a bunch of ideas of what you. So you start with the sticky notes. Mm-hmm. So you just gather a bunch of ideas of what you might be. You want the app to be an artificial intelligence app, or you want the app to be about dating or delivering medicine to remote areas. So you just get some bunch of ideas on sticky notes, and then you find your idea. Maybe you find 3. And then you just do like a sketch, like a quick hand sketch of what you think the app might look like. And then you do like a prototype. And then I will say at the end, you just use one of the programs to put your design together. Mm-hmm. And then you also, like before the end, maybe want to show it to people to see what they think about it, to see what things you might want to change. So like that.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. That sounds perfect for your process. Yes. Anybody else?
Hi, I would like to introduce a little bit of my team's process. So at the beginning, we will do some interview. We go on-site interview or online interview. We create some like online survey, and then we collect the results and analyze it. We will sit down and have a team meeting and put on the sticky notes and analyze also our target users' pain points and their what they are struggle with or what make they satisfied. And we start to create our persona. Mm-hmm. And then we will start to create a user journal map. And then we will do some like workflow. Like if we create a web app or like mobile app, like we will create the workflow with the developer. So, and the next step will be starting to create our like paper prototype. And so sometimes we will, after we finish the paper prototype, we will just directly to find our user to test out. And if it works out, we start to do the HiFi prototype and interaction prototype. If sometimes we lack of time, we just skip off the paper prototype. And after we make the prototype, we will go back to our user and test it out if it works out, or if they feel anything weird and not comfortable, then we go back to fix it. And then we work with the design team and the develop team, work together and fix it and go back to test again. And after this test done, and we start to wrap up everything and deliver it.
Sounds perfect for your team.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I'll just, hi, my name is Shadima. I'm a designer as well. I'm just gonna add my process and my neighbor's process here. It was more around exploration of like a UI element, say like a like button, and his was a sticker. And what we found was that for us, we had to work really fast. We had to go through the really quick discovery process. In my case, I went through just looking at articles to see how people felt about, liking and commenting and reactions, looking at a book and looking at quotes and seeing what are the ideals people have, and then competitive analysis, looking and seeing, okay, how are other apps delivering things? And we understand that people are already expecting these kinds of reactions from their apps. And then from there, I went on to exploring and discovering into like prototyping different ideas. And in his case, it was with different moods, making seals, different feelings that, a person might have, and putting them into an actual character. And then after creating that, had to reduce to a few choices and then come up with a pack and then present that. But realize that in the short time, say a week or 2 weeks, we only have time to get to the exploration point. So we ended up there, and then we presented to the team, and we had to review those designs to see if that's something that you want to run with, and you would test further. But we don't really have time to go through personas, a lot of flows. And in some cases, we might actually be deploying that to engineering very quickly because it's just really based on one feature. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Anybody else? Last call.
Okay, I look at this project and discuss with the guys and see that the weak part of this double diamond is the problem definition, because my practice shows me that real research, real problem definition starts when you deliver the first version of project, especially if you have no expertise at the start, because when you do discover and define, you have your own imagination of this process, but user have own imagination. When you do the first deliver, usually receive maybe beta or alpha version, usually will see that is not true, and this start of this real research starts after first version delivery.
That is totally correct. That was going to be my next topic. So yes, no, that's awesome. So this template is there to support you, to get you started, but it's definitely not the end of what your process should look like. And each and every company or a team or each and every feature might have a different process. It would be based on this, but it might not be this. So let's look into a real example. This is the process that oops. Yes, thank you for designing. I forgot the nice puppy. But let's look into let's look into an example that that I have worked on. So this was for a feature a few months back, where I had to come up with a process, and this is something that I actually did. So let's start walking through it, and then we'll see how that spans out. So the first part, the divergence part, was owned by the PM in my company. PM is the product manager. So the PM would come up with a very broad statement or a very broad problem definition and say, okay, let's design a feature. So once we have this very broad definition, the designers and the product managers or the product owners would work together to just see all the options, explore all the options, and do all the kinds of research and see if it even aligns with our business objectives and with what we're even doing. Once we have this, the designers kind of take the ownership. So now still the definition, the problem statement is not clear yet. But as you can see, the problem statement is not clear yet, but the designer would come in, would start working on certain things. So let's say we have a really broad set of requirements. I, as a designer, would start working on all these journey maps and personas and site maps, and then work very closely with the product owner to come to this final problem statement. So at that time, once I have the definition, I would actually start looking into how I can solve that through the design. And once I have that, I would converge down, create high fidelity prototypes or wireframes, depending on what is required from the team or what is required by the development. I would actually come to this. Now, I think as this gentleman pointed out, this might not work. That is totally fine. It might not work. So for me, this flat process did not work. And I had to go back, after I did a lot of testing, I had to go back, change a lot of things. So in my case, I didn't have to change the definition because I work for an enterprise company. There is a very, very focused product that we work on, and based on the features. So after doing a lot of research and after doing a lot of testing and validating with the user, I had to go back, look for, like, start from the scratch, start looking for options. I started doing whiteboarding and paper sketches to come up, and I had to do that multiple times. So other people's process might actually force them to have this little circle, go back to this first diamond. So this diamond is just a starting point. You might have to have a lot more iterations, because as designers, as people who are involved in the product, need to have a lot of iterations. So this is how I came up with my first this is how I came up with my first process in the company that I started working earlier this year. So it might look completely different for you, but this is how it spans out. So now, how do we develop these senses or tentacles to customize this process? So first, in order to answer how, we would have to talk about the constraints. So what constraints do we have? The biggest constraint that everybody has is of time. If you are doing your portfolio, or if you are in school, or if you are a working professional, there is always a deadline. When do you have to release the feature? When does the portfolio has to be ready to start interviewing? When do you have to be done? That's the goal people start with. So there's always a lot of time constraint. Then there is team constraint. Sometimes you don't have enough people. Sometimes you don't have variety of talent on your team to do fancy visuals, or you don't have enough people to get things done on time. Sometimes there is some constraint from the technology side. Let's say our engineers are using certain kind of stack. They might not be able to do certain fancy things that we as designers would come up. And then obviously there is design. You might not have the right tools. You might not have the right budget to use tools, or you might not even have certain design system in place yet. So things like that would always show up. So once you have these constraints, now we have to embrace these constraints. There is no other way around these constraints. So how to proceed with these constraints? If I, as a designer, was asked, what was that one thing I could remove or decrease in the design process. Because I work for an enterprise product, I would say, let's do a little bit of light testing instead of going all in. Let's say if I have 3 weeks instead of 3 months to do something, I would try to, because there are no other steps that I can remove. I cannot remove understanding the problem definition. I cannot remove the step where I am actually trying to figure out what to design. I cannot remove the step where I'm actually designing and creating prototypes. So one of the options could be to do a lightweight concept testing. This might not work for everybody. Again, this only depends on your team, and this would work only if your feature permits you to do that. The other one is retrospect. So as a design team, you should always go back to your team after the feature is released to think about what went well, what didn't go well, what were the things that you can do to improve your process. You can, as a designer on your team or for a feature, you should always set up some time with your team and talk to them about that, okay, these things went well. And sometimes it's really good to learn things that went well and didn't go well. The other thing is journaling. So journaling is actually a technique where you would write down in your journal. It's like a personal journal, but you just write down things related to design. You would write down about your thoughts about design. So let's take an ideal day where you go to office, you had a couple of meetings, and then you start to design. There are certain thoughts that would pop up in your mind that might not be related to the feature you're working on, but maybe it's about a different feature. Write it down. Then there are certain questions that you might have for somebody who is not in your office or somebody who is there. Write it down and then act on it. Once you have this journal for quite some time, you would start seeing patterns in the type of questions you ask. You would start seeing the type of questions you ask. And then once you start looking at this pattern, it might also help answer it for yourself as well. You would be able to answer it by yourself, because once you start looking at the pattern, you already got answers for the previous questions. So in future, that might just help you answer those questions. So this might be one of the ways in it would help you. But if you start doing and start writing stuff, you'll be able to articulate. You'll be able to articulate certain design decisions that you make. Once you start articulating, your world becomes really easy. Second is peer review. So you already spoke to your team in a team setup, but do set up some time with your peers, one-on-one time where they can ask you questions, where you can ask them questions and talk about, hey, what do you think what went well in this process? If you were working on this feature, do you think I could have done something better? Or if you were working on this feature, would you be able to suggest me something that might have worked better? Or something that went really well? It's always good to hear good things about yourself. Cross-functional team retros. So what I have seen is people set up these retros only after the feature has been released. Engineering, product owners, designers, everybody would get together in a room and do a retro, but it's only done after the feature has been actually developed and released out. Now, once you design, that design might not go into development for a really long time. It might take a few weeks, couple months, couple years. So what you as a designer should initiate is start setting up meetings with cross-functional teams to understand what went well, what didn't go well, what you as a designer can do better. They might have expected something completely different from a design, but you end up giving them completely different things. So always set up time to understand what went well, what didn't, across different teams. The other thing is a little bit of a shortcut, and I kind of like it, is the way in which you identify your process. So let's say you're working in a team, and there are different people in your team. There is like a senior person, there is a junior designer, there is a manager. Once you get a feature or a product to work on, talk to them about their thoughts, about what would be an ideal feature or what they would have done. It's just a pot of ideas that you can fill, and then see if you want to use anything, because experienced designer definitely carry a bucket of experiences with them which everybody can utilize. So you should try using that process. So once you have all this information, now what? Once you are able to figure out, once you're able to figure out the process for yourself or a product or a team, how do you go about? Once you have this ready, you don't have to feel the pressure of using the same process every single time. You will end up creating processes for each and every feature that you work on, each and every project that you work on at workplace, for your portfolio. If you are showing 3 or 4 different projects, all of them might end up having different processes. Shortcuts are okay. And if you see, there is a little asterisk over there. So definitely take shortcuts. As designers, there is a lot of time constraint and we will have to work according to that. So how do you go about it? What do I mean when I say shortcuts are okay? Shortcuts are okay. You can skip steps. You can start doing high fidelity directly. But remember this. This example works well for me. So if you're hiking, you're tired, you decide to take a shortcut. If you get lost, you have to work twice as hard or much more than that rather than just taking a shortcut. The same theory applies here. If you take shortcuts, it's fine. But make sure that you don't get lost. Otherwise, it creates a lot of overload for you. And just because there is a process doesn't mean that there has to be something for you to show it to people. So you might have to use the cookie cutter method where you will be like, oh, this is the things I have done and this was my thought process. But that doesn't mean that you'll always have to be like, okay, this is my wireframe or this is my sitemap or this is my customer journey map. You don't have to go a step back to create that little process, even though the feature or the thing that you're trying to do is already done. So I would like to conclude by saying, be resourceful. Have this mindset and be resourceful. Collaborate. Collaboration is the key to being a good designer. Collaborate with designers, engineers, product owners, executives, whoever you can. Deal with the constraints and remember the 4 Ds. And thank you. So I would like to thank Aaron and the whole the South Bay UX team for having me here, and Google and everybody involved in this process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would like to open up the floor for any questions.
Raise your hand if you have a question so I could give you the mic.
Shreya, hi, I'm Ranjani. Really nice presentation.
Thank you.
So my background has been in journalism, and a lot of my process with using that as a transferable skill to build custom content for businesses is pretty much the same in terms of structure, but it varies based on the business that I'm working for to build the content. So one of the things I want to ask you is, how do you decide what a shortcut is? And when do you know that you're not lost? Obviously, when you miss the deadline, that's not what I'm asking. But hopefully you still make deadline and you know that this is a more constructive or a more productive process.
So one thing that I have learned is when you take a shortcut, or whenever I take a shortcut, I always end up doing high fidelity. From the definition to the high fidelity, that's done. But there might be multiple reasons why I do that. I would have a very intense design system ready for me. So it's okay for me to skip those steps. And how I know if I got lost in like using that shortcut or going down that route is when my thought process is not in alignment to the definition or the problem statement. So obviously it has to be well structured. If it's not well structured and everybody has their own interpretation, it might not work. But let's say if it is well structured and everybody has this very particular expectation, but then your thought process is a little bit more different, and then you still end up taking the shortcut, your design is done, you're before deadline or towards on time for the deadline, it still would be that you got lost. Now, once your thought process is in alignment to what the goal should be, and it might take you a couple more steps like whiteboarding or sketching or whatever you think works for you, that's the point where you realize that, okay, this is something that's
I can
where
optimize.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Namrata. So I think I'm totally aligned with all the sort of process and the double diamond and things like that. I think as a startup, it's somehow you sometimes need some niftier way to do things sometimes because you don't have that kind of resources. And my question is, in terms of sort of tools out there for user experience testing. So if I have something and I don't have the wherewithal to employ researchers or I want to test an idea, are there any tools, forums, etc., which you can recommend, which can gather a set of users of a particular profile, induct them, test it, and do it very rapidly and very lean and kind of put together in that sense?
So I also work for a startup, really fast-paced startup. So we also don't have the liberty to do all these research. But in terms of tool, I know there is a tool out there. I think it's called Maze, but I can double check for you. In which you can actually, it's like InVision, it's like prototyping, and you put your prototypes up on there, and then the user can come in and it will give you statistics about how long they stayed on their page, where their mouse was, and things like that. But that's one of the things, but you would still need users for it. To answer the second part of your question, where you mentioned that, is there like a forum or a place where you could just get like tons of people to like sign up and do things? There are different forums that are there out there, but it depends on the product. If it's like a very common product, like let's say like a online shopping app, then there might be multiple, you might get a lot of feedback. But if it's very niche product or an enterprise product or a B2B product, it might not be that easy for anybody to find that big forum that's out there. So you might have to do a little bit more digging. But I would say that you can always take feedback from designers. There are a lot of design communities out there, and I think one of the biggest is South Bay UX. You can try to get feedback on your designs, maybe not domain or not validate the ideas, but definitely you can start with the design feedback. Hope that helps.
Any other questions?
You had mentioned it was like one of the first recommendations of something. It said lightweight test.
Concept testing.
Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. So typically when we do concept testing, or typically when designers want to do concept testing, you spend a lot of time making sure the idea that you're going down is the best, or the prototype that you were working on is something that you would want to do it. But sometimes, because of one of the constraints, that might not be possible. You might not have weeks to do it. You might end up doing the lightweight concept testing. So instead of talking to 15 people, you might end up talking to 5 people. Or instead of coming up with 6 different options, you might end up coming with 2 different options. So it might not really harm the process, but it's not something that you would ideally want. So something like that.
I have a quick question for the development cycle that works. So like I said, I see the double diamond, right? But while that is happening, what is the dev team doing, right? Is now, because to me, it seems like I'm going to get like a waterfall process that's going to happen. But I want to be able to execute development as well.
Sure. So let's take the example where the development is actually waiting. So basically, you have a time crunch. So that means that you start with releasing a very basic or an MVP feature or the product. And then once the development is already working on it, you can start working on fixing all those minor things that you would want. Let's say the button is not the best or icon is not the best, but you should not stop or block everybody in your team or in the company from moving forward. They should start working on it while they set up all the major things. I think updating icon is pretty simple. Or let's say updating the color. So you might have to prioritize based on the things that you would want to get done first and not have people be blocked on you. And then you can always come back. As a designer, you can always come back. You can always revisit and be like, okay, I think I need to redo this. These icons need to be updated. Or maybe this workflow is not the best. It has like 5 extra clicks. Maybe I can decrease it down to 3. But then there is always a structure there for engineering to start working on.
Any other questions? All right.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. One of the kind of problems that I had with the 4Ds is that we as designers, we sometimes claim things that, we don't do, like we don't develop, and when designer's resume says develop this and this, and then you start asking person what actually did they develop, and you kind of find out that they developed nothing, they just draw something. And therefore, I became a little bit of stickler for the words, but I understand that what we are trying to do here is like to 4Ds. So I would like to kind of suggest different Ds here. And instead of something like detect, to decide, maybe draw, and then drop or distribute, because to stay away, basically, to stay away from things like develop and deliver, because we deliver everything. We deliver, milestones when we are discovering. We're delivering things when we are, drawing. So like deliver is not really a great thing because you're not delivering it once and at the end of the process. And yeah, that's everything I have to say. Thank you.
No, definitely. That's a really good point. But this double D process, so I wanted to share the template, and I think I have mentioned in most of my slides at the bottom. So I did not design the thing or use the word. So it was actually, this process was actually developed by British Design Council. So I just picked it up, and this is one of the widely accepted process, and that's how people implement it as a template. We don't have to use it as it is, but I just didn't want to create confusion by putting my own words and say design or drop or things like that. But definitely you should be able to customize according to your process. But this template is actually provided by the British Design Council themselves.
How has your design process evolved throughout the course of your career? Are there parts of it that you focus more on now with more experience that you focused less on before, or potentially vice versa?
That's a really good question. So when I started, I didn't have process. I just used to put things together and just like draw lines across it. But when I came across this process, I saw that it has evolved, at least for me, from the place where I would just try to make this as my ideal process, have each and every step, try to do each and every portion of it. But now with all of these experience that I have, I feel that these steps are not mandatory. These are out there. You could choose them to do that. You could choose them not to do that. And one of the things that I have dropped a lot is doing intensive testing, because that's maybe because I always have worked for the enterprise products, and we don't have access to as many users as easily as maybe a different product or a consumer product might have. So, but the design portion, it kind of decreases as well, because once I have the design system ready, it's all good to go. It's really stable. My design time decreases because I just have to drag and drop components. So it kind of like starts shrinking from both the sides a little bit. But again, it depends on the team or the company or the feature.
So I just have a quick follow-up question to that testing. You were saying like you do not do the intensive testing, but I think for us, that I'm also working on enterprise product. The challenge is really, one, we are a startup. We don't have that resources to do a lot of testing. And second is, if that's to be, there's definitely very difficult to recruit many users to test our new flow. So I wonder how you conduct those testing, but because right now we are basically talking with our engineers, designers, and we design the flow by ourselves. So I just would like to know your method on testing on like enterprise product.
So a couple of things that we do is when a product is actually sold, so we have actual customers, we typically go back to them and ask for their feedback for a newer feature. We would give them that, oh, this is an early access feature. Would you mind testing it and sharing your feedback? So that's one of the things we do. When our engineers or the system engineers who are trying to actually sell the product, what they do is they also try to get feedback while they do the initial talking about the product. So they also talk about, oh, these are our existing features and you will have access to this. And this is our early access. What do you think about it? Because it's really hard to find that specific time, as you mentioned, right? Like they don't want to spend a lot of time talking to you about your product, giving feedback about your product when it's a B2B or an enterprise product. So a lot of our sales folks kind of take that initiative and they try to ask them the questions up front, try to understand it before they actually sell the product, or if they have sold the product, they try to get the feedback from our existing customers. So that's something that a lot of companies I know around here do, and like startups do. So those are like a couple of ways you can start the process in which you can get feedback.
Any more questions? Oh, where? Was there a question? Oh, in the back. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi, thank you for sharing the process. I have a quick question about the design system. So in the startup company, do you think they need a design system by themselves?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last
I mean, in the startup company, do you think they need a design system for themselves? I mean, we need to create something quick, but sometimes we need to create the system for themselves.
Oh, so do you mean if you had to create something really quick and you didn't have the design system? Is it still... It really depends, like how that quick thing is going to manifest. Is it going to are you going to build on top of it, or is it like based on the time? Is there like a time crunch and you need to like do it like tomorrow? Then you might not have enough time to create this design system. But yeah, it's pretty important once you have more designers and once you're building on the same feature, then you would want to make sure that you have a good design, a strong design system, so that people don't start using their own padding or color or size or shade or whatever, right? But if it's just for a quick prototype, it could definitely work out depending again on what the goal is.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Hands up high. Okay.
So you said having a design system, a lot of times you will take shortcuts by going straight from your concept to HiFi. Is that correct?
Yes, sometimes. Yes.
I'm curious why you would go to HiFi instead of lo-fi if you have a design system.
That's a really good question. So I'll answer that in twofold. So the first thing is sometimes, like with experience, you know how to get to the design point. So you know, let's say you're supposed to design the login flow. If I'm designing, it might take me a couple of hours with the high fidelity. But if somebody junior is designing, it might take a couple of days to figure out the flow. To answer the second portion of the question, as in why not just do low fidelity or just like wireframes and give it to the developers and they already have their system set up. So recently what has happened to me is I have done that portion. I actually like put my hands in that dirt. I created wireframes. I shared it with folks. They really loved the wireframes. They fell in love with it. They're like, this is perfect. There's no problem. And I was like, yay, I'm an amazing designer. There's no iteration. Everything worked fine. And then when they actually started working on it, they were not able to figure out or pick on those loopholes that wouldn't work on the wireframe. So the second time I did the same thing. I created a little bit more detailed wireframe. Awesome. Feedback was like all good. There was no critical feedback. It went through the product owners, the PMs, and it went to the development. And they're like, oh, I don't think this is possible. And then I realized that as human beings, we are very, very relative and contextual. Once, if there is a product that has been already made, we're always so focused in looking at that product then our thinking just goes towards that product. We can see if it's right or wrong only when it's in context of that whole design system and whole of this product area. So when people see wireframes, they think, oh, it's just a sketch. I don't have to focus on it. It's fine. I could catch these errors later on. It's just an initial frame. So even though the aim of the designer is not for them to focus on the visuals, but then there's a lot of contextual misinterpretation that happens during that time, that it ended up being that I had to create the high fidelity. It has happened to me multiple times, actually, because a lot of people suggested that do wireframes. People will not focus on the colors of the chart or the chart themselves or the layout. And it worked out initially well, but when it would be a lot more work for me at the end, and it would just keep on pushing the deadlines, even for the developers.
Any more questions? Have time for maybe one more? All right.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. And I have a question. Before you are doing like iteration before release, or when you're doing like user testing, where do you find like a target users, like a real target users for the product, for a product?
That's a very tricky question. I think I mentioned that earlier. So it actually depends on what the product is or what domain you are in. So let's say you are in a B2C domain, like a ride-sharing app or online store or something, right? You might be able to find users easily, like maybe your neighbors or your friends or people around you, or just maybe like taking a walk and finding people to talk to. That might be easier. But if you are into domain of, like where I'm working right now is SaaS enterprise backup, that's going to be super difficult for me to like bump into somebody who actually wants that, because the persona that I'm working for is very limited. It might be 1 per 100 people company, but different domains might have different users. It depends on the number of users. And then you'll be able to find the set of people who can help you with the feedback or research based on the domain you are in.
Please give a big round of applause for Shreya. Thank you so much for sharing your design process with us.